So some of the concerns, which are completely understandable, are if you do genetics research, could this lead to the development of a prenatal test? For some people, even just the word genetics is a trigger. What are these scientists going to do with our DNA, and are they trying to eradicate us? Anyone who knows me knows that that is not my agenda. It's an ethical minefield. If we change the way we see autistic people, so there's acceptance and respect, then we don't need to start looking at causes that may have caused harm to a person. And we should be celebrating those differences.
We've had such a great response to the podcast, and so many of you have been in touch asking what you can do to help. It's really simple. Just follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. That way we can reach more people, and that way we can celebrate these great minds that think differently. Our next guest is one of the most influential figures in autism research. Sir Simon Baron-Cohen is a Cambridge professor, director of the Autism Research Centre, and a leading voice in the field for over 4 decades. Knighted for his contributions, he's published over 750 papers and developed key autism diagnostic tools that have shaped both the scientific and public understanding of autism. Although Simon's influence in the field is undeniable, his work has also sparked significant controversy, especially around biology, gender, and genetics. Today, we unpack the impact of his research, both the good and the bad, and we explore the history and future of autism. Just a heads up, we do discuss some difficult topics, including mental health and suicide. I've waited over a year to speak to Simon. He didn't disappoint. Let's get into it. Let's see how great minds think differently. Simon, I spoke to my 5-year-old this morning, River.
Okay.
She's recently diagnosed autistic. And I said, Riv, today I'm going to talk to one of the world's leading experts in autism. Do you have any questions for him?
Excellent. So it's as if she's here with us in the room. Okay.
And her only question was, well, is he really one of the world's leading experts in autism?
So I'm not going to answer that one. It's not for me to judge. But I guess why I'm here is that I've been doing research into autism for 40 years. And over that period, you can imagine our idea about what autism is has changed a lot.
So let's go back 40 years,
yeah, sure.
Simon, and start there as to what you understood autism to be 40 years ago.
If we keep in mind where we are today and try and do the comparison with what was going on back in the 80s, I would say that the majority of autistic kids that we saw in those days were not only autistic, but also had some level of learning disability.
Okay.
So all the textbooks from around that period said that 3/4 of autistic people have learning disability. So I'm a psychologist. Learning disability means having an IQ less than 70. If you think of the IQ being on the bell curve, where the average for the population is 100, that was kind of significantly below average. And if we fast forward to today, it's almost the mirror opposite, that 3/4 of autistic people who get their diagnosis do not have a learning disability. So that's already one massive change that's happened, that we've kind of opened up the diagnosis of autism to anyone in the population. I mean, back in those days, we were seeing such a different section, if you like, or segment of autism.
And was it only children back then?
It was gradual. I think diagnosis of adults, it wasn't as good as it is today. There were only a few places in the UK where you could get your autism diagnosis. There were kind of centres, so, specialist clinics. Whereas today, you could get your autism diagnosis in any small town, in a child development centre or privately.
And who was diagnosing autism 40 years ago?
Right. And it was mostly child psychiatrists, I would have said.
Okay.
Maybe paediatricians, but it's very much medical. Some psychologists or clinical psychologists too. Basically what we've seen, the turning point seemed to be around the end of the 90s. Because if you look at the prevalence, the rate of autism in the population, it's absolutely skyrocketed. A recent study found a 700% increase in the prevalence of autism since the year 2000. But in terms of the rate, it's just a thing that's happened. So when I started, autism in the textbooks was 4 in 10,000 children.
Okay.
So it was considered quite rare. And today it's 1 in 36 children. So that is a massive increase.
Where does the diagnostic criteria and the disappearance of Asperger's fit within that?
Yeah. So over that time, the diagnostic criteria themselves have evolved. So you might know that the diagnostic criteria are what's laid down in a publication called DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is published by the American Psychiatric Association. There's a kind of European equivalent that's published by the World Health Organization. That's called ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. They tend to kind of list autism as, well, in the case of the World Health Organization, a disease. We don't use that language anymore, I would hope.
Sorry, they do still?
Well, it's called ICD, so the International Classification of Diseases. And in the American equivalent, DSM, they talk about disorders. So autism would be classified as a disorder. Again, we've moved right away from that language, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about it, particularly within the shift to the neurodiversity framework, trying to move us away from this kind of very narrow medical lens, and just a focus on, I suppose, the disability side without looking at the whole of an autistic person.
Yes.
But in those various kind of revisions of the criteria, just trying to think, DSM-4, that was the 4th edition, was published in 1994. And that introduced Asperger's syndrome as an option, as a diagnosis that was available for the first time. So I'd say that was quite a moment in the history of autism, that suddenly there was this new category called Asperger's syndrome. And that was basically autism without learning disability and without language delay. And we opened a clinic in 1997 for adults who thought, I wonder if I've got Asperger's syndrome. There was nothing really available in the NHS. So we got charitable funding to open a clinic like that. It's still going, but after the Autism Act in 2009, which is a parliamentary act saying there should be provision, the NHS did take over our clinic, so it's now part of the NHS.
And it's not assessing for Asperger's?
So there's been a shift. So we called it Asperger's in those days. And then what happened is in 2013, the 5th edition of this DSM, this Bible that psychiatrists use, came out and decided to remove Asperger's syndrome. So Asperger's syndrome was really only available for about 20 years.
Okay.
And it was removed partly because there was scientific evidence suggested that different clinicians weren't using the term consistently. So there was a kind of question about its reliability. That was the main reason, actually. So in 2013, they just decided to put autism under a single umbrella called ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder. Still got the disorder part. I don't use that term. I do recognize autism as a disability, but also as a difference. That's the diversity part.
And where does Hans Asperger feature in that?
Yeah. So again, that was part of my experience in that I was also editor of a journal, a scientific journal. And one day I got an email from a historian of medicine saying that he had done some research and that he'd looked at the medical notes that Hans Asperger, the pediatrician working in Austria, in Vienna in the 1940s, looking particularly at children that had been referred to a euthanasia clinic during the time of the Nazis. And we ended up publishing his article, which was the first evidence that Asperger himself had collaborated with the Nazis.
Wow.
So that was 2018 when it got published. And at that point, we decided to drop the term Asperger's syndrome. If there was any hint that this was a subgroup on the autism spectrum that was associated with someone who'd collaborated with the Nazis and that had led to the deaths of even a small number of children, that would be unacceptable.
I'm interested as to why Asperger's was called Asperger's if it was deemed to be autism without learning disabilities.
Yeah.
And yet, from the little I do understand, I guess, about the Nazi regime and the euthanasia aspect was that those children that were referred had severe learning disabilities and weren't on the quote unquote high functioning side.
Yeah, I think Hans Asperger was seeing a range of children.
Okay.
Some accounts historically argue that he was trying to protect some of his kids by talking about their talents. And the Nazis were particularly kind of concerned or focused on children who were, in quotes, a burden on society. So eugenics was the approach at the time that a lot of doctors subscribed to. The idea that anyone who might be a burden on society, why are we supporting them? Today, again, that is totally unacceptable. But under the Nazi regime, that was very common as an attitude. And actually, that attitude wasn't just limited to Germany during the Holocaust. It was widespread in the States, in many countries.
What is the history of autism, Simon?
The history of autism. So Hans Asperger was writing about autism in the 30s and 40s and giving lectures on it in German.
Okay.
And in 1981, a British psychiatrist called Lorna Wing kind of brought his work to the attention of the English-speaking world. Writing in English, she had an article called Asperger's Syndrome, so she kind of gave it a name. And she talked about autism without learning disability. And that's kind of how that term came about.
But pre-Hans Asperger, what did we know about autism?
Yeah, well, what we knew was that there were these criteria that needed to be applied if you were giving out a diagnosis. That's to do with social difficulties, communication difficulties. There was a focus on repetitive behavior, which I don't think quite captures what's going on, but that was one of the symptoms, if you like, and so-called obsessions. Those were kind of the cluster of traits or characteristics that were used to decide if someone was autistic or not.
Why did you take an interest in autism?
So my own personal contact with autism was after I graduated from university. I got a job teaching in a school for autistic kids. When I say small, there were only 6 children.
Okay.
And there were 6 teachers, so it was 1-to-1. This was 1981. Not much was known about what to offer educationally to autistic kids, but it was an opportunity for me as a young graduate to get to know 6 kids in a lot of detail. They were kind of the age of your daughter.
Okay.
And I spent a year there working with these kids, and I just found it really interesting. Autistic kids are interesting.
What did you find interesting?
You would find this very uneven profile. People have talked about this, that autistic people, but children as well, they latch onto things and they see the world in a very fresh, different way. And they get fascinated by things that maybe other people might miss. And that was very refreshing. It wasn't necessarily that they were being influenced by social norms or their peer group. They were just following their own interests, but obviously behaving quite differently. Sometimes autistic kids would come very close to your face as if they didn't really understand some of the implicit rules about social boundaries and personal space.
Yeah.
But they were just kind of being themselves. And, some of the kids got fascinated by mathematics, for example, and they would do that all day long if they had half the chance. They were learning differently. They were processing information differently. And I found it interesting. And at the end of that year, I went off to do a PhD at University College London here. At the time, their national expert, a woman called Uta Frith, and just, did research trying to understand the social side of autism, what's going on in terms of how autistic kids understand other people.
And what was going on in terms of society's beliefs and understanding around autism back then?
I think there was a recognition that these kids needed extra support. There were charities like the National Autistic Society that had been set up by parents like Lorna Wing, probably in the 60s or 70s. There were parents who were fighting to try and get more support for their kids. There wasn't so much of a focus on adults. That came later, not only as the first generations of autistic kids started growing up, but also, as I mentioned earlier, with the recognition that some people had missed out on a diagnosis in their childhood. Ideally, they should have got their diagnosis in childhood since all the signs were probably there.
Yeah.
But somehow they got through their childhood and their teens without a diagnosis, maybe struggling along the way, and didn't get their diagnosis until adulthood.
And what beliefs did we have around where autism came from at that time?
Right. I mean, this is a fun conversation, I have to say, because it's kind of pushing me to sort of remember how much has changed. When I started in the early 80s, there wasn't much talk about autism being genetic, for example, whereas we now know that autism runs in families, that a big chunk of the cause of autism is genetics. Some people estimate it may be about 80% of, the cause of autism is genetic.
Wow.
But there wasn't
What
much.
do they put the other 20% down to?
So we could talk about that, the hidden 20%,
Yeah.
but not so much about neurodiverse people, so much as, what the factors that are causing autism. But just to say on the genetics side, it probably took until the 90s and early 2000s for geneticists to really get involved and for the discovery that there were indeed genes that are mutated or changed in some way that are associated with autism. So far, I think about 100 such genes have been identified in association with autism. They're called rare genetic variants. They're kind of genes that carry a mutation, for example. And they're only seen in about 5 or 10% of autistic people. So they can't by themselves explain the genetic part of autism. And often if you're carrying one of those mutations, it has quite a big impact on your development. For example, difficulties with language or with so-called motor development, like walking and on time, or maybe epilepsy, neurological differences. But nevertheless, genetics seems to be playing a role. So there's been a shift towards looking at genes that we all carry. These are called common genetic variants that you find in the population. They're not rare, but they come in different versions of the gene. And increasingly, geneticists are identifying different versions of a gene. They're called polymorphisms that are seen more often or associated more often with autistic people. And that research is still progressing. And to find those aspects of the genome, you need very large samples. We're talking tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of autistic people and non-autistic people to look at those differences, because they're kind of small differences in our DNA. But that's all going on. But we still know that autism isn't 100% genetic. And we know that from twin studies. So you can have identical twins, so they share all of their genes, but one is autistic and one isn't. So the fact that you can find these twin pairs, they're called discordant, that one is autistic and one isn't, means that whatever role genetics is playing, there must be some non-genetic factors that also contribute. And we've been looking at some of those non-genetic factors, like hormones during pregnancy. So our group in Cambridge has been focusing on whether the baby during pregnancy is exposed to higher levels of specific hormones. They're sex steroid hormones like testosterone, estrogen, which change brain development, and finding evidence that that's the case. So there are these other factors.
So the genome piece, I guess, is quite a sensitive area.
It is.
When you then kind of get to prenatal testing, and that sparks, I know with the Spectrum 10K project, obviously that's now stopped. How do you draw a line between the dangers of fast forwarding the tape to being suddenly, we're doing a prenatal test and someone's deciding whether their child should be born or not, if they're autistic or not autistic?
It's an ethical minefield. We were funded by the Wellcome Trust to look at the genetics of autism and its links to health, but we got some pushback on that study you're referring to. The study was going to involve collecting DNA from 10,000 autistic people. So we called it Spectrum 10K. And after the kind of concerns that were raised by some autistic people, we decided to hold a consultation with the autism community just to sort of explore whether this was one of their priorities, but also whether genetics research could be done safely for the reasons that you're talking about, really. So some of the concerns, which are completely understandable, are if you do genetics research or even research around other prenatal factors, like hormones in the womb, could this lead to the development of a prenatal test for autism, sort of along the lines that has been developed for Down syndrome, almost without society realizing it? Prenatal screening was introduced. Parents women who are pregnant were kind of offered this option, but it does suddenly sort of change our view of the child and the disability. It does bring in a form of eugenics. It's not the same as the eugenics under the Nazis that we talked about earlier, which was compulsory euthanasia. That was really abhorrent. But here, there's a different kind of eugenics going on where parents might have the choice, if there was a prenatal test, whether to continue the pregnancy or not.
It's the editing, I guess. It's
Yeah,
the selection aspect.
Exactly. So we decided to come out as a research centre with our values, and we published them on our website. So we're very clear that although we do prenatal research, we don't do research that is towards the development of a prenatal test, and other values as well. We don't do research towards a cure or a prevention of autism, precisely because of the whole change, the shift towards seeing autism as part of neurodiversity.
40 years ago, was there any work going on to find a cure for autism, or any of the prenatal side, or based on our beliefs then, was there any thinking or work going on that we needed to cure this?
I would say that you can find evidence, not necessarily in the UK, but just internationally. You can find evidence that people talked in those ways.
Wow.
So there were charities in the States. There was one called Cure Autism Now. There was another one called Defeat Autism Now. That's a strong reaction. And there were charities. There's even one that's still around called Autism Speaks in the US that had as its mission statement about curing and preventing autism. So they were sort of seeing autism as something that was bad in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
They were seeing it very much as a disease or a disorder that needed prevention or cure. Very medical approach. They weren't seeing the whole person, because we know that autistic people have strengths as well as challenges. So they have differences, not just disabilities. And the strengths and differences part was kind of being overlooked.
How recently do you think we've recognized the strengths for autistic people?
I'd say probably there was a shift in the late 90s. But if you think that autism was first described in the 40s, by a psychiatrist called Leo Kanner, and then Asperger we talked about also in the 40s. Mm-hmm. It probably took till about the 90s before...
50 years.
Yeah, before researchers started kind of focusing on the strengths of autistic people, not just the things that they struggle with. Mm. And that shift of kind of not neglecting one side of autism, that was a big gap in the first 50 years, you're right. But since then, what we've learned, and our group has contributed to this, is that autistic people have strengths in attention to detail, in memory for detail. They have a fascination with patterns in the world and how things work. So I call that systemizing, because we're surrounded by systems, but autistic people might be particularly attracted to understand systems. There's kind of lots of areas where autistic people show remarkable strengths, where they're performing above average, better than non-autistic people when you give them tests.
Yeah.
All of that was kind of missed. And all of this is kind of leading to the idea that autistic people process information differently. Their brains are different. They're not worse or disordered or diseased. They're just different. So it's very much sort of in line with the framework of neurodiversity. But we should sort of remind listeners or viewers that the word neurodiversity was only coined in 1997.
Yeah.
It was quite late in the history of ideas.
Yeah.
And in the history of psychiatry and medicine, it was quite late to arrive. It came from a woman called Judy Singer in Australia, who included it as part of her undergraduate thesis in sociology. The idea that different brains in the population, they're simply different.
And every single one is different.
I think that's right. So I would even push back against the idea of neurodiverse and neurotypical, as if these are binary, because we're all different. But some of the ways in which brains are different do include disability. And it's important that we recognize that, because under the Equality Act, for example, people with disabilities they're eligible for support. So recognizing someone's disability is really important.
Where did gender feature 40 years ago? Sorry, I'm really winding you back.
It was always recognized that autism was diagnosed more often in boys than in girls.
Okay.
So back then in the 80s, I guess the sex ratio was about 4 boys to every 1 girl. And if we fast forward to today, I think autism is still being diagnosed more often in boys, but the gap is closing a bit. So it may be 3-1, or in some studies 2-1. So still more boys are getting diagnosed. And that's when you do big population studies. So that's epidemiology.
Okay.
Certainly we saw it in our clinic that more women and girls started to come to the clinic to seek a diagnosis from the 90s onwards.
Okay.
So your question might be, why is it still the case that boys are diagnosed more often? But also maybe why did the ratio start to shift in the late 90s? Well, first of all, there could be a biological part of autism that makes it more likely for boys than girls to end up with a diagnosis. And that's partly why we were looking at those hormones in the womb. We know there's a genetic predisposition, but if there's a hormonal contribution as well, and boys produce more of these hormones prenatally, that could explain why boys are more likely to end up with a diagnosis. But then there are social factors that we need to kind of pay attention to. Could be that the way society is structured, if you're a girl and you're autistic, there might have been greater stigma to hide your autism. Certainly in your childhood, it's called masking or camouflaging, but that may come at some cost. If you're not allowed to just be yourself, if you feel this kind of social pressure to hide who you are and feel a greater pressure to conform, that could give rise to more anxiety, for example. I think in a very positive way, more girls are now asking, about their difference and whether that might be autism, and more women too. So I think that's probably why the gap is closing between the two genders.
Where was your thinking and where is it now around this idea that male brains systemize and female brains empathize?
Yeah. I might try to add a bit of nuance to those two statements, if that's all right. Because what we find is that if you go out into the population and give people questionnaires about empathy or about systemizing, you do find, on average, differences. So females, on average, score higher on the empathy quotient relative to males, and males, on average, score higher on the systemizing quotient relative to females.
This is in general.
Exactly. So we did a big study of 600,000 people just in the population, asking people to complete these questionnaires. So the empathy quotient asks you how easily you can pick up on what other people are thinking or feeling, how easily you can read people's facial expressions and infer their state of mind, putting yourself into someone else's shoes to imagine their thoughts and feelings. And on a population level, 600,000 people, women score higher on that questionnaire.
And when was this, Simon?
So that was published in 2018. But that was a big study, but earlier work had been in smaller samples. And then this other questionnaire, which is called the systemizing quotient, just asks you how interested you are in a range of systems. So it might be mathematical systems, it might be mechanical systems, musical systems, natural systems like the weather.
I'm very interested in the weather.
Okay, including a rather unexpected hailstorm on my way to your studio today.
Yeah.
And what we found was that males, again, on average, score higher than females on this systemizing measure. And then when we turned to autistic people, in that study, we had 36,000 autistic people take part. So it was an online study. And what we found was that autistic people show even higher scores when it comes to systemizing. So this is kind of talking about their strengths again. But according to their own report, they score below average on the empathy quotient. So
across the board?
Well, we'll just
gender, age, demographics.
So this was an adult study, so it was online, so people had to be over 18 to take part. But we have done similar studies in teenagers and children where we asked parents to fill in the questionnaires about their child.
Okay.
So we find very similar patterns. So it's given rise to this idea of a male and female brain, but I think today probably that terminology is not very helpful. You could talk about brains that lean more towards empathy and people, and brains that lean more towards understanding systems, the world of objects and patterns, and find there are these gender differences. And the autistic people seem to be, well, in some of the language we've used, an extreme of the typical male profile. But really what it means is that they are even more interested in systems and patterns relative to their interest in people.
And why have people not liked some of that thinking?
Well, I think, as I said, it requires a bit of nuance to even explain the ideas. If you just took the headlines, it could easily be sort of misinterpreted as autistic people lack empathy, which is not true. But it'd be very easy to sort of create a headline like that. Autistic people do have empathy. We found in our own research that autistic people, first of all, they do care about others. So even within empathy, you can break it down into what's called cognitive empathy, which is imagining the thoughts and feelings of other people, and then affective empathy, which is whether you have an emotional reaction to someone else's state of mind.
When that's more visible to you.
Yes, exactly. Or when it's pointed out to you.
Yes.
What we found is that autistic people don't show any difference in terms of affective empathy, but they struggle with cognitive empathy. So reading facial expressions would be an example. But once it's pointed out, if you tell an autistic person that someone else is suffering, they care about it and they want to do something about it. So the idea that autistic people lack empathy just isn't borne out by the evidence. But sometimes these kind of headlines are easily misinterpreted.
So do the people that score more highly on the empathy quotient, do they score lower than the quote unquote national average?
Yeah, they do.
Okay.
That's right. But I think, maybe what's been unhelpful is that some of these questionnaires just give you a single score. So your score on the empathy quotient, you get that score. It goes from 0 to 80. So if you scored 10 out of 80, that sounds quite low. Maybe that's because the questionnaires themselves don't break down into don't separate these two aspects of empathy. So not just kind of picking up on other people's thoughts and feelings, but caring about other people's thoughts and feelings. So I think there's probably scope for more research, which really teases these two aspects of empathy apart.
I remember listening to you talking, the first time I heard you talk about this explanation of empathy, and I was really taken aback. I was really highly related to what you were saying, and it perfectly explained how I am around empathy.
Right.
Where did the two sides of the empathy coin, where did this theory come from?
Yeah. Well, for me, I wrote a book back in 2011 called 0 Degrees of Empathy. It wasn't a book particularly about autism. It was a book about empathy in the population and the different factors that could lead somebody to have either higher or lower empathy. And when you kind of look at empathy across different diagnoses in psychiatry, autistic people might struggle with what I called cognitive empathy. But, if you compared them to people with a different diagnosis, like antisocial personality disorder or psychopaths, those people often have very good cognitive empathy. They can figure out what you might be thinking and they can deceive you and manipulate you. But they lack the other part of empathy, the affective part, so that they could go on to be quite cruel and hurt other people. And autistic people, the way I kind of laid it out, seem to be almost the mirror opposite of people with antisocial personality disorder. They struggle to read other people, but they care about others. So it's a very specific kind of disability. And so it was kind of those comparisons that made me think we really need to sort of separate out these at least two components within empathy.
And why did you call it 0 Degrees of Empathy?
Well, I was interested in that book to understand both cruelty and kindness. So these are kind of behaviors that you see in the population. We talked earlier about the Nazis and how under that regime, awful things were done by people towards other people, the concentration camps being a very clear example. So I was kind of interested in this question about how individuals can lose their empathy. What are the different factors that can lead to that? And some of those things are social factors, like propaganda, and this idea of in-groups and out-groups and how we can maybe change the way we see other people and dehumanize other people. So there could be social factors that could lead to a reduction in empathy. We also know that from evidence from John Bowlby's work, he was a paediatrician working here in London at the Tavistock Clinic, but looking at children who were quite antisocial and who had experienced neglect or abuse in their childhood, and finding that a lot of those kids grew up to be capable of hurting others or just being antisocial in their behavior. So it looked like early experience also contributes to how much empathy you end up with. If you've had the experience of being in a family with loving parents, feeling loved, that seems to contribute to your ability to empathize and care about other people. So these are kind of social factors that contribute. So that book was really kind of focused on trying to understand all the different determinants of empathy.
Do you think that vaccines cause autism, Simon?
Here's a very direct question. I would say my reading of the evidence is that vaccines do not cause autism. Well, back in, I think it was 1997, there was one doctor, Andrew Wakefield, that many people will have heard about, who published this article in The Lancet suggesting that the MMR vaccine could cause autism. Over the years, that led to a lot of research testing whether that was really true. It's a kind of a big claim, particularly as the earliest age at which autism could be diagnosed was around 18 months old, so toddlers, which is also around the age where kids get vaccinated. So it could have been that you start seeing the signs of autism, and it coincides with when vaccines happen. But some people might put these two things together and suggest that the vaccines cause the autism. Could have just been a child who was on track for showing autism anyway.
Why do you think the CDC are investigating or are going to investigate the correlation between vaccines and autism?
Yeah.
Even if there isn't really any evidence.
Right. What I observed after the Wakefield article was published was a lot of research went on to test whether it was the case that kids who got the MMR vaccine, were they more likely to end up with an autism diagnosis than kids who were not vaccinated. There were opportunities to look at this in big populations. I think in Denmark and in Japan, where you could compare half the population who'd been vaccinated and half who hadn't, and the autism rates were the same in both halves of the population. So I think it took quite a lot of research to conclude that there wasn't a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. I'm not aware that this is being reopened, but perhaps it is.
It is.
Yeah.
In the US.
Okay, but particularly around MMR or about other vaccines?
I think it's of the view that, hey, hold on a minute, there seem to be more autistic people now.
Yeah.
Something's wrong.
Right.
I don't believe that anything's wrong. Let's have a look at vaccines.
Yeah.
For causing these higher autism rates.
Yeah.
And let's also have a look at toxins in food.
Okay.
Anything to say on that one?
Well, it sounds like people are kind of looking for environmental factors that might be causing autism or contributing. In terms of the sort of increased prevalence or rate of autism, I don't think we have to leap to vaccines or toxins to explain it. I think there might be much more ordinary factors that could explain why we're now much more aware of autism, partly just kind of greater awareness. So charities, podcasts, just talking about autism raises awareness. And, you know, we talked earlier about how 40 years ago, if you wanted to get a diagnosis for your child, if you thought they were autistic, there might have only been a small number of centres in the UK where you could take your child. Whereas today there are a lot more clinics. So just the availability of clinicians who can diagnose by itself could explain why we diagnose it more often, more sort of health professionals on the ground. We talked about the widening of the definition of autism to include not just kids with learning disabilities, but people without. Even if we look at factors like social media, where people are talking about their experience of being autistic on Instagram or TikTok and just talking to a wider audience, where other kids or teenagers or adults can start identifying with people who are neurodivergent. Again, it just means that we're reaching more people, getting them to start thinking about this as a possibility. So I don't know that we need to sort of jump to, is there something in the environment that's kind of causing these increased rates of autism?
The subtext is something bad is happening
right?
Because there are more autistic people being diagnosed and that that's not a good thing.
Yeah.
And therefore we should investigate the causes, and the causes are not good things. The causes are
Right.
what's the impact of a vaccine, or what's the impact of a toxin in food.
Yeah. If we change the way we see autistic people, so there's acceptance and respect for difference, then we don't need to start looking at causes that may have caused harm to a person. This is just how they're born.
Yeah.
We talked about this, a large fraction of autism is genetics, and we should be celebrating those differences.